My sister convinced our dying father to change his will, stealing the restaurant that was rightfully mine after 20 years of sacrifice. But when I discovered the forged documents and her web of lies, I realized her greed would cost her everything she thought she'd won. After dedicating my entire adult life to building our family legacy, she destroyed it all with one signature, never knowing that her betrayal would unravel in ways she never imagined. I am Victoria Chen, a 34-year-old executive chef and restaurant manager in San Francisco, California. For the past 2 decades, I've poured my heart and soul into Chen's Garden, the small but beloved Chinese-American restaurant my father built from nothing. While other kids my age were partying in college, I was learning the books, perfecting recipes, and working 16-hour days to keep our family dream alive. My younger sister Caroline had always been the golden child, beautiful, charming, and smart enough to become a successful real estate attorney. But she never showed interest in the restaurant until the day she decided she wanted to own it. The betrayal began 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was prepping vegetables for lunch service when Caroline walked through the kitchen doors, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor. She rarely visited during business hours, preferring to keep her distance from what she called the smell of grease and disappointment. But that morning, she wore an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of guilt and defiance that made my stomach clench with unease. "Victoria, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying an authority that didn't belong in my kitchen. "It's about Dad's estate." Our father had been battling pancreatic cancer for 8 months. The prognosis was grim. Weeks, maybe a month if we were lucky. We'd had countless conversations about the restaurant's future, and he'd always assured me that Chen's Garden would be mine. I'd earned it, he said, through years of dedication and sacrifice. Caroline had her law career. I had the restaurant. It seemed fair, logical even. "What about it?" I asked, not looking up from the bok choy I was chopping. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board was soothing, a meditation I'd perfected over years of prep work. Caroline cleared her throat. "He's decided to leave the restaurant to both of us. 50-50 partnership." The knife slipped, nicking my finger. A drop of blood fell onto the pale green vegetables, and I stared at it, my mind struggling to process her words. "That's not what we discussed. Dad knows I've been running this place. You've never even worked a single shift. Things change, Victoria. Dad wants to be fair to both his daughters." There was something in her tone, too practiced, too rehearsed. But I was drowning in the implications of her words to notice the warning signs. A 50-50 partnership with Caroline meant constant battles over every decision. It meant she could override years of my careful planning with her legal expertise and business connections. It meant the restaurant I'd built with my own hands would never truly be mine. Over the following weeks, as our father's condition deteriorated, Caroline began inserting herself into every aspect of the restaurant's operations. She questioned my supplier relationships, critiqued the menu, and suggested improvements that would fundamentally change the character of Chen's Garden. She brought in consultants and accountants, treating our family legacy like just another business acquisition. "We need to modernize," she'd say during our increasingly frequent meetings. "Expand the dining room, update the decor, maybe add some fusion elements to appeal to a broader demographic." Each suggestion felt like a knife to my heart. Chen's Garden wasn't just a restaurant. It was a repository of family memories, a testament to our father's immigrant journey, a place where generations of customers had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet Tuesday dinners. The faded photographs on the walls, the mismatched chairs that told stories of decades of use, the hand-painted menu board that my father had lettered himself, these weren't flaws to be corrected, but treasures to be preserved. But Caroline saw only profit margins and missed opportunities. She talked about selling to a restaurant group, about franchising the concept, about leveraging our brand for maximum return on investment. The language of business that had made her successful in real estate felt like a foreign invasion in the space where I'd learned to cook from our grandmother's whispered instructions. The final blow came 2 weeks before our father passed away. I arrived at the hospital for what I thought would be another routine visit, only to find Caroline emerging from his room with a manila envelope clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. She looked startled to see me, like a child caught stealing cookies. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the envelope. Legal documents, she said quickly. Just some paperwork Dad wanted to take care of. Our father looked exhausted when I entered. His room, more frail than I'd ever seen him. The cancer had stolen his appetite, his energy, and now apparently his clarity of mind. When I asked him about the documents, he seemed confused, his eyes clouded with pain medication and the fog of approaching death. Caroline, she said. The lawyers. He mumbled, his words trailing off into incoherent whispers. I should have pressed harder. I should have demanded to see those documents immediately. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and I was so focused on spending our remaining time together that I let the moment pass. It's a mistake that would haunt me for months to come. Our father died on a Thursday morning in early October, with both Caroline and me holding his hands. Despite everything, we cried together, united briefly in our shared loss. For a few precious hours, we were just two daughters mourning their father, the restaurant forgotten in the face of more fundamental grief. The funeral was beautiful. The entire neighborhood came out to pay their respects, sharing stories of how our father had fed them during difficult times, had remembered their children's names, had made them feel like family. Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop next door brought a wreath made entirely of herbs from our restaurant garden. The Johnsons, who had eaten dinner at Chen's garden every Friday for 15 years, served as pallbearers. These people weren't just customers. They were the community our father had built one meal at a time. After the service, as people gathered at the restaurant for the reception, Caroline pulled me aside. We stood in the kitchen where we'd had our first conversation about the estate, but everything felt different now. The space seemed smaller, darker, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. We need to discuss the will reading, she said, her grief temporarily replaced by the focused efficiency that made her such a formidable attorney. It's scheduled for Monday morning. I'll be there, I replied, wondering why her expression seemed almost pitying. The law office was sterile and cold, nothing like the warm chaos of the restaurant kitchen where I felt most at home. Caroline sat across from me, her black suit impeccable, her expression unreadable. Our father's longtime attorney, Mr. Peterson, looked uncomfortable as he opened the will and began to read. The first few paragraphs were standard legal language, but then came the words that shattered my world. I leave my restaurant, Chen's Garden, including all property, equipment, recipes, and associated business assets, to my daughter, Caroline Chen Morrison, with complete ownership and control. The room spun around me. That's not right, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the thundering of my heart. There's been a mistake. Mr. Peterson looked confused. I'm sorry, Victoria. This is the will your father signed just 2 weeks before his death. It supersedes all previous versions. I stared at Caroline, searching her face for some sign of surprise, some indication that she was as shocked as I was. Instead, I found only a carefully controlled mask of neutral professionalism. In that moment, I understood that she had orchestrated this entire betrayal. The documents she'd been carrying that day at the hospital, the confusion in our father's eyes, the way she'd inserted herself into every aspect of the restaurant's operations. It had all been preparation for this moment. You knew, I said, the words hanging in the air like an accusation. You knew, and you let me believe. Victoria, she began, but I cut her off. How could you do this? How could you take advantage of him when he was dying? Caroline's composure cracked slightly. I didn't take advantage of anyone. Dad made his own decision. Maybe he realized that sentiment isn't enough to run a successful business. The cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of 16-hour days, of missing dates and social events and normal experiences because the restaurant needed me, of learning every aspect of the business from food costs to health department, regulations, all of it dismissed as mere sentiment. I left the law office in a daze, walking the familiar streets of Chinatown without seeing anything around me. The restaurant would open in a few hours for dinner service, and I realized with horrible clarity that it might be one of the last times I'd have the right to walk through those doors. Caroline owned everything now, the building, the equipment, the recipes I'd perfected, even the relationships with suppliers and staff I'd cultivated for decades. When I finally arrived at Chen's garden, I found Caroline already there, standing, in the dining room with a clipboard and measuring tape. She was planning renovations before our father had even been buried a week. "We need to talk about your role going forward," she said without preamble. "Obviously, things will need to change." "My role?" The question came out as a laugh that bordered on hysteria. "Caroline, I am this restaurant. I know every recipe, every supplier, every regular customer's order. Without me, you have nothing but an empty building and some outdated equipment. I have the deed, Victoria. I have the business license, the permits, the trademark on the name. What I don't have is time for your dramatics." Her words revealed the depth of her planning. She hadn't just stolen the restaurant, she'd thought through every legal detail, every potential challenge I might raise. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in grief. It was a calculated theft executed with the precision of the attorney she'd become. "What do you want from me?" I asked, hating how defeated I sounded. "I want you to stay on as head chef. Same salary, same responsibilities, but you'll report to me as owner. No more making unilateral decisions about the menu or suppliers or staffing. This is a business, not a personal fiefdom." The offer was both generous and insulting. Caroline was willing to let me continue doing the work I loved, but only as her employee, only under her control. Every decision I made would be subject to her approval. Every change I wanted to implement would need her permission. The restaurant I'd built would become her toy, her investment property, her stepping stone to whatever business empire she was planning to construct. "I need time to think," I said, though we both knew I had no real choice. Without the restaurant, I had no income, no career prospects, no identity beyond being the woman who used to run Chen's garden. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes of restaurant memorabilia, old photos, newspaper reviews, thank you cards from satisfied customers. Each item told part of the story of Chen's garden, and by extension, the story of my adult life. I'd defined myself entirely through my relationship to the restaurant, and now Caroline had severed that connection with a few legal documents and a dying man's confused signature. Over the following weeks, I watched Caroline systematically dismantle everything our father had built. She fired Maria, who had worked as a server for 12 years, replacing her with younger, more professional staff. She changed suppliers, choosing vendors who offered better profit margins over the family businesses our father had supported for decades. She hired a designer to update the decor, stripping away the photographs and personal touches that made Chen's garden feel like a home rather than just another restaurant. The customers noticed. Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, complained that her usual tea tasted different. The Johnson family asked why their favorite corner booth had been replaced with a sterile high-top table. Even the health inspector, who had been coming to the restaurant for 15 years, commented that something felt different about the place. But Caroline was unmoved by their concerns. "Growing pains," she'd say when I brought up customer complaints. "They'll adjust to the improvements." What hurt most wasn't the changes themselves, but the casual way Caroline dismissed the relationships that had taken decades to build. To her, Mrs. Rodriguez was just the old lady who complains about the music being too loud. The Johnsons were the couple who takes up a 4-person table for 2 hours. These weren't people with histories and stories. They were inefficiencies to be managed. 3 months into Caroline's ownership, I discovered the truth about how she'd acquired the restaurant. I was cleaning out our father's desk when I found a folder of legal documents that Caroline had apparently missed. Among them was the original will, the one that left the restaurant to me, exactly as our father had always promised. My hands shook as I read the familiar language, seeing my name where Caroline's appeared in the version read at the law office. The document was dated 6 months before our father's death, long before his final hospitalization, when his mind was still clear and his intentions unmistakable. But there was more. Hidden beneath the will was a series of documents that told the full story of Caroline's betrayal. She had convinced our father to take out a large loan against the restaurant, using her connections to expedite the approval process. The loan documents were confusing, full of legal jargon that our father, despite his business acumen, wouldn't have fully understood. Caroline had presented them as refinancing to help with his medical bills, but the fine print told a different story. The loan was structured so that if it went into default, ownership of the restaurant would transfer to Caroline as cosigner. And default it did, exactly as she had planned. Our father, weakened by chemotherapy and overwhelmed by medical expenses, had missed several payments. By the time he died, Caroline was legally entitled to claim the restaurant as settlement for the debt. The will I found was real, but it had been superseded by the loan agreements Caroline had orchestrated. She hadn't forged our father's signature, or tricked him into signing a new will. She had been far more subtle and far more cruel. She had manipulated a dying man's desire to provide for his family, turning his love into a weapon against the daughter who had sacrificed everything for his dream. As I sat in that empty office, surrounded by the evidence of my sister's betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and confusion that had paralyzed me for months crystallized into something harder and more focused. Caroline had stolen my life's work through manipulation and legal maneuvering, but she had made one crucial mistake. She didn't understand what made Chen's Garden truly valuable. The restaurant's worth wasn't in its physical assets or its profit margins. It was in the relationships, the reputation, the intangible connections that bound the business to its community. Caroline might own the building and the equipment, but she couldn't own the loyalty of customers who had been coming to Chen's Garden for decades. She couldn't own the trust of suppliers who had extended credit during tough times because they believed in our family. Most importantly, she couldn't own the knowledge and skills that I had spent 20 years developing. Over the next several weeks, I began to lay the groundwork for my revenge. It started small. Conversations with longtime customers about their disappointment with the changes, discussions with suppliers about their concerns over Caroline's business practices, quiet words with the remaining staff about their frustration. With the new ownership, I didn't lie or spread false rumors. I didn't need to. The truth was damaging enough. Caroline's inexperience was showing in every aspect of the restaurant's operations. Food costs were rising due to her inferior suppliers. Customer satisfaction was plummeting as she prioritized efficiency over service. Staff turnover was increasing as she created a hostile work environment with her constant micromanagement and criticism. The first crack in Caroline's confident facade appeared when Mr. Huang, who had been supplying our produce for 15 years, terminated his contract. Caroline had been pushing him to lower his prices and deliver on a more rigid schedule, never understanding that his relationship with our family was built on mutual respect and flexibility. When he told me privately that he could no longer work with someone who treated him like a vendor rather than a partner, I suggested he might find better opportunities elsewhere. Within a week, Caroline was scrambling to find a new produce supplier, dealing with inferior quality and higher prices, as she learned the hard way that loyalty has value in business relationships. The second crack came when our longtime customers began to drift away. It started with the elderly regulars who had been coming to Chen's Garden for decades. They felt unwelcome in the sterile new environment Caroline had created, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar staff and disappointed by the changes to recipes they had loved for years. When they asked me about the changes, I would simply say, "This isn't the restaurant it used to be," and let them draw their own conclusions. Caroline noticed the declining revenue but blamed it on economic factors beyond her control. She had no idea that her own arrogance and insensitivity were driving away the customer base that had sustained Chen's Garden through decades of ups and downs. The final piece of my revenge came together when I learned about Caroline's expansion plans. She had been secretly negotiating to open a second location, using Chen's Garden as collateral for another loan. She saw the restaurant not as a legacy to be preserved, but as the foundation for a business empire she planned to build. I realized then that simply exposing her betrayal wouldn't be enough. Caroline had the legal right to own the restaurant, regardless of how she had acquired it. If I wanted true justice, I needed to ensure that her theft would ultimately cost her everything she had gained. I began documenting every mistake Caroline made, every customer complaint, every instance of her inexperience leading to problems. I photographed the health code violations that began appearing as she cut corners to improve profit margins. I saved emails showing her unprofessional communications with suppliers and staff. Most importantly, I began quietly reaching out to former employees and long-term customers, letting them know about my plans to open a new restaurant. The idea had been growing in my mind for weeks. If Caroline wanted to own Chen's Garden, she could have it. But I would create something new, something that honored our father's memory while building on everything I had learned during my 20 years in the business. I would call it Victoria's Table, and it would be everything Chen's Garden had been before Caroline's cold business calculations stripped away its soul. I found a small space 6 blocks away, in the heart of the neighborhood where many of our former customers lived. The rent was reasonable, and the previous tenant had left behind much of the kitchen equipment I would need. More importantly, it felt right. Warm and welcoming in a way that reminded me of Chen's Garden in its early days. The hardest part was keeping my plans secret while continuing to work for Caroline. Every day, I had to smile and pretend to support her vision while watching her destroy everything I had built. She had become increasingly paranoid about my loyalty, questioning every decision I made and scrutinizing every conversation I had, with customers or staff. "I hope you're not thinking of doing anything foolish," she said one afternoon, cornering me in the kitchen after I'd been talking with Mrs. Rodriguez about her granddaughter's upcoming wedding. "Like what?" I asked, continuing to chop vegetables without looking up. "Like starting your own restaurant. Because you should know that I have non-compete clauses in all my employment contracts now. If you try to open a competing business within 5 miles of here, I'll sue you into bankruptcy." I finally looked up at her, seeing the fear behind her aggressive words. "Caroline, I've been working in this kitchen for 20 years. This is all I know. Where would I go?" But even as I reassured her, I was making mental notes about the legal threats she was making. Caroline had always been quick to use her legal training as a weapon, but she had forgotten one crucial detail. I had grown up in the same household, listening to the same dinner-time conversations about contracts and negotiations. I knew enough about the law to understand that her non-compete clause would be difficult to enforce, especially given the circumstances under which she had acquired the restaurant. 6 months after our father's death, I was ready to make my move. I had secured financing for Victoria's Table, hired 3 former Chen's Garden employees who were eager to escape Caroline's management style, and secretly arranged contracts with several of our old suppliers who were frustrated with Caroline's treatment of them. The day I planned to give my notice was a Thursday, exactly 8 months after our father had died. I arrived at Chen's Garden early, as I always did, to prep for the lunch service. Caroline was already there, standing in the dining room with another woman I didn't recognize. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez," Caroline said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She's going to be taking over as head chef." The words hit me like a physical blow. Caroline wasn't just planning to fire me. She was replacing me with someone who had probably never set foot in Chen's Garden before that morning. All my careful planning, all my secret preparation for the moment when I would announce my resignation, suddenly seemed pointless. "I see," I managed to say, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Sarah comes highly recommended from several upscale establishments downtown. She has experience with Asian fusion cuisine and modern restaurant management techniques." I looked at Sarah, who seemed uncomfortable with the situation despite her professional demeanor. She was probably a good chef, but she wasn't Chinese, had never worked in a family restaurant, and clearly had no understanding of what made Chen's Garden special to its community. "When do you want me to leave?" I asked Caroline, proud that my voice remained steady. "Today would be good. Sarah needs time to familiarize herself with the kitchen before the dinner rush." 20 years of my life, dismissed with the casual indifference Caroline might show to a server who had given 2 weeks notice. I looked around the kitchen one last time, seeing not the sterile workspace Caroline had created, but the warm, chaotic heart of the restaurant where I had learned to cook, to manage, to dream. "I'll need an hour to gather my personal items," I said. Caroline nodded. "Of course. And Victoria, thank you for everything you've done for the restaurant. I know Dad would have appreciated your dedication." The hypocrisy of her words was breathtaking. She had stolen everything our father had built, destroyed the community he had nurtured, and fired the daughter who had devoted her life to preserving his legacy. And now she wanted to invoke his memory, as if she had been honoring his wishes, all along. I packed my knives, my recipe notebooks, and the few personal items I had kept in the office. As I carried the boxes to my car, I noticed several of our regular customers watching from across the street. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood, and they already knew that something significant was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed the street to help me load the boxes into my trunk. "Mija, what's happening? Are you leaving Chen's garden?" I looked back at the restaurant where I had spent most of my adult life, seeing Caroline through the window as she pointed out features of the kitchen to her new hire. "Chen's garden is leaving me, Mrs. Rodriguez, but don't worry, this isn't the end of the story." That afternoon, I called a press conference at Victoria's table. It wasn't much, just a folding table set up in the empty dining room, with a few local reporters and several longtime customers who had heard about my firing. But as I stood there, looking out at faces I had known for years, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since before our father's death. "My name is Victoria Chen," I began, "and for 20 years, I was the heart and soul of Chen's garden. Today, I was fired from the restaurant I built with my own hands, by my sister who inherited it through legal manipulation while our father was dying." The words felt dangerous and liberating at the same time. I was breaking the silence that Caroline had counted on, exposing the ugly truth behind her carefully constructed story of business succession. I told them everything. About the forged loan documents, about Caroline's systematic destruction of our father's relationships with suppliers and customers, about her plans to expand the business while ignoring the community that had sustained it for decades. I showed them copies of the original will, the loan agreements, and the documentation of health code violations that had begun appearing under Caroline's management. Chen's garden was more than a restaurant, I concluded. It was a community center, a place where neighbors became family, and meals became memories. My sister saw only profit margins and expansion opportunities. She has the legal right to own that building and that name, but she cannot own the spirit of what my father created. That lives on here, at Victoria's table. The story broke in the local newspaper the next morning, with follow-up coverage in several food blogs and neighborhood publications. The headline read, "Sister Steals Family Restaurant Through Deathbed Manipulation," and the article laid out the full scope of Caroline's betrayal. Caroline's response was swift and predictable. Her attorney sent a cease and desist letter demanding that I stop making defamatory statements about her business practices. She threatened to sue for libel, claiming that my accusations were damaging her reputation and affecting Chen's garden's profitability. But the truth has a way of protecting itself. Every document I had referenced was authentic and legally obtained. Every quote I had provided was accurate and verifiable. Caroline could threaten lawsuits all she wanted, but she couldn't change the facts of what she had done. More importantly, the community responded exactly as I had hoped. Longtime customers began boycotting Chen's garden, sharing their own stories of how Caroline's changes had made them feel unwelcome. Former employees came forward with accounts of her abusive management style and unreasonable demands. Suppliers confirmed that she had tried to strong-arm them into accepting lower prices and stricter terms. Within 2 weeks of my press conference, Chen's garden's revenue had dropped by 40%. Caroline was forced to offer discounts and promotions to attract customers, but the damage to her reputation was spreading faster than any marketing campaign could repair. Meanwhile, Victoria's table was generating excitement throughout the neighborhood. I had scheduled a soft opening for the following month, and reservations were already being taken by word of mouth. Former Chen's Garden customers were eager to support my new venture, and local food bloggers were planning reviews based on their memories of my cooking from the original restaurant. But Caroline wasn't finished fighting. 3 weeks after the newspaper story broke, she made a move I hadn't anticipated. She filed a lawsuit claiming that I had stolen proprietary recipes and customer information when I left Chen's Garden. According to her complaint, every dish I planned to serve at Victoria's table was based on trade secrets that belonged to her restaurant. The lawsuit was legally baseless, but strategically shrewd. Even if Caroline couldn't win in court, she could tie up my resources and delay Victoria's table's opening indefinitely. Legal fees would drain the money I had saved for the new restaurant, and the uncertainty would make suppliers and investors nervous about working with me. For the first time, since I had discovered Caroline's betrayal, I felt truly afraid. She had the resources of a successful law practice behind her, while I had only my savings and the support of a community that, while loyal, had limited financial means. If she succeeded in delaying Victoria's table's opening, she might be able to weather the boycott of Chen's garden long enough for the controversy to fade from public memory. That's when I remembered something our father had taught me during my early days learning the restaurant business. Victoria, in any negotiation, find out what the other person needs most and then figure out how to take it away from them. What Caroline needed most was legitimacy. She had acquired Chen's garden through legal manipulation, but she still needed the community to accept her as the rightful heir to our father's legacy. Her entire business plan depended on customers eventually forgetting about the controversy and returning to the restaurant out of habit and convenience. But I realized that Caroline had made a crucial error in her understanding of the neighborhood dynamics. She thought of Chen's garden's customers as consumers, who would ultimately choose convenience and familiarity over principles. She didn't understand that in a tight-knit community like ours, reputation and relationships matter more than location or habit. I decided to fight Caroline's lawsuit not in court, but in the arena where I had the advantage, the kitchen. Instead of waiting for Victoria's table to open officially, I began hosting pop-up dinners at the space, serving the same dishes that Caroline claimed were proprietary to Chen's garden. The first dinner was a small affair, just 20 customers, mostly longtime regulars who had been asking when they could taste my cooking again. I prepared a simple menu of 5 dishes, all of them recipes I had learned from our grandmother and refined over decades of cooking. Caroline could claim ownership of the Chen's garden name and building, but she couldn't copyright the knowledge that had been passed down through our family for generations. Word of the pop-up dinners spread quickly through the neighborhood. Each week I served a few more people, and each week the contrast between Caroline's sterile version of Chen's garden and my authentic cooking became more apparent to anyone who cared to notice. The breaking point came 2 months after Caroline had fired me. I was preparing for another pop-up dinner when Maria, my former server, called with devastating news. Chen's garden had failed a health inspection, and the health department had temporarily shut down the restaurant until Caroline could address a long list of violations. She's been cutting corners everywhere, Maria explained. The new chef doesn't understand proper food storage, and Caroline won't pay for the deep cleaning the kitchen needs. There was mold in the walk-in cooler and rodent droppings near the prep station. The irony was almost too perfect. Caroline had fired me to bring in a more professional chef, but her cost-cutting measures and inexperience had led to the kind of health code violations that Chen's garden had never experienced during my tenure. Our father would have been devastated to see his pristine kitchen reduced to such conditions. The health department closure made local news, and the story inevitably included references to the ongoing legal battle between Caroline and me. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't just about a family dispute over a restaurant. It was about competence, about the difference between someone who understood the business and someone who saw it only as a profit center. Caroline's lawsuit against me began to look increasingly desperate and vindictive. She was claiming that I had stolen recipes while simultaneously proving that she couldn't maintain the basic standards of food safety that I had upheld for 20 years. Her legal threats were undermined by her practical failures, but I knew that Caroline wouldn't give up easily. She had too much pride and too much invested in Chen's garden to admit defeat gracefully. When the health department allowed the restaurant to reopen after extensive cleaning and equipment repairs, she hired another new chef and launched an aggressive marketing campaign to win back customers. Her strategy was to position Chen's garden as a new and improved version of the old restaurant, cleaner, more efficient, more professional. She offered discounts to first-time customers and promotions for large parties. She even hired a social media consultant to manage the restaurant's online presence and respond to negative reviews. For a few weeks, it seemed like Caroline's campaign might work. Chen's garden's dining room was busy again, filled with customers who were attracted by the discounts or curious about the controversy. Food bloggers wrote cautiously positive reviews, praising the restaurant's updated decor and professional service. But success built on discounts and curiosity is inherently unstable. As the promotions ended and the novelty wore off, customers began to notice what was missing from the new Chen's garden. The food was competent but uninspired, lacking the subtle complexity that had made our father's recipes special. The service was efficient but cold, missing the warmth that had made customers feel like family. Most importantly, Caroline had failed To understand that a restaurant's true value lies not in its profit margins, but in its ability to create experiences and memories that keep customers coming back year after year. She had optimized Chen's Garden for short-term success while destroying the intangible qualities that had made it profitable in the first place. Victoria's Table officially opened on a Thursday in March, exactly 1 year after our father's death. I had chosen the date deliberately, wanting to honor his memory while making it clear that this restaurant represented a new chapter rather than an attempt to recreate the past. The opening was everything I had dreamed it would be. Mrs. Rodriguez brought flowers from her shop next door to Chen's Garden, now willing to walk the extra 6 blocks to support my new venture. The Johnson family reserved their usual corner table, joking that it felt like coming home after a long and disappointing vacation. Even some new faces appeared. Younger customers who had heard about the restaurant through social media and food blogs, drawn by the story of authenticity triumphing over corporate manipulation. But the most satisfying moment came when I saw Caroline herself standing across the street during the dinner rush, watching through the window as Victoria's Table bustled with the energy and warmth that Chen's Garden had once possessed. She stood there for nearly an hour, and I could see in her posture the recognition of what she had lost through her betrayal. Caroline had won the legal battle for Chen's Garden, but she had lost the war for legitimacy and community acceptance. Her restaurant was still operating, but it was a hollow victory. She owned the building and the name, but I had taken with me the relationships, the reputation, and the soul of what our father had created. Over the following months, the contrast between our two restaurants became increasingly stark. Victoria's Table thrived, building a loyal customer base that appreciated both the quality of the food and the story of perseverance behind it. Chen's Garden struggled, cycling through chefs and staff members as Caroline tried desperately to recapture the magic she had never understood in the first place. The final vindication came 8 months after Victoria's Table opened, when Caroline quietly put Chen's Garden up for sale. The restaurant was hemorrhaging money, burdened by the debt she had taken on for renovations and expansion plans that had never materialized. Her second location had never opened, and her dreams of a restaurant empire had crumbled under the weight of her own inexperience and the community's rejection of her leadership. I learned about the sale from Mr. Peterson, our father's attorney, who called to ask if I had any interest in buying back the original restaurant. The irony was almost overwhelming. Caroline was offering to sell me the restaurant she had stolen, at a price that reflected its diminished value under her management. "I'm not interested," I told Mr. Peterson. "Chen's Garden died when she took it over. I'm not interested in buying a corpse." The restaurant eventually sold to a chain that specializes in authentic ethnic dining experiences. They kept the name but changed everything else, turning our father's legacy into a generic Asian fusion concept that could have been located anywhere in America. It was a fitting end to Caroline's ownership. The community connection she had never valued was finally severed completely. As for Caroline herself, she eventually returned to practicing real estate law full-time, though her reputation in the neighborhood never fully recovered from the controversy. She had achieved her goal of owning a restaurant, but the victory had cost her more than she could have imagined. She had lost not only money, but also the respect of her community and any chance of reconciliation with me. The relationship between us remains broken, perhaps irreparably. We see each other occasionally at family gatherings or neighborhood events, exchanging polite greetings that barely mask the depth of our mutual resentment. Caroline acts as if nothing happened, as if her betrayal was simply a business decision that got blown out of proportion by community gossip. She speaks to me with the condescending tone she might use with a former employee who had been difficult to manage, but I can see the truth in her eyes when she thinks no one is looking. The failure of Chen's Garden haunts her in ways she'll never admit publicly. She had convinced herself that success in real estate law would naturally translate to restaurant management, that her legal expertise and business connections would compensate for her lack of understanding about food service and community relationships. The spectacular failure of that assumption cost her not just money, but the respect she had always taken for granted. At our cousin's wedding last spring, I overheard Caroline talking to our aunt about learning experiences and market conditions that had made restaurant ownership challenging. She spoke about Chen's Garden's closure as if it had been an inevitable result of economic forces beyond her control, rather than the predictable consequence of her own arrogance and inexperience. The neighborhood was changing anyway, she said, swirling her wine glass with affected sophistication. All those old customers were going to die off eventually. I was just ahead of the curve in trying to attract a younger, more affluent demographic. The casual dismissal of the community that had sustained our family's restaurant for decades revealed everything I needed to know about Caroline's character. Even in failure, she couldn't acknowledge that her approach had been fundamentally wrong. She couldn't admit that treating longtime customers as obstacles to progress rather than assets to be treasured had been a catastrophic mistake. Our aunt, who had known our father since childhood, looked uncomfortable with Caroline's explanation. "Your father always said the customers were like family," she said quietly. "He knew all their names, remembered their birthdays." Caroline's smile tightened. "Dad was sentimental about business. It's one of the reasons the restaurant never grew beyond a single location. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions to achieve real success." I wanted to interrupt, to remind Caroline that our father's sentimentality had built a thriving business that supported our family for 30 years. I wanted to point out that his death had left the restaurant profitable and debt-free, while her hard decisions had driven it into bankruptcy in less than 18 months. But I held my tongue, knowing that anything I said would only escalate the tension and ruin our cousin's special day. Instead, I focused on the conversations happening around me, stories about Victoria's table, compliments on the food, questions about when I might consider expanding or opening for lunch service. The contrast between Caroline's defensive explanations and the genuine enthusiasm people showed for my new restaurant spoke louder than any argument I could have made. The success of Victoria's table has exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. Within 2 years of opening, we were booking reservations weeks in advance. Food critics from the city's major newspapers began making the trip to our neighborhood, writing reviews that praised not just the quality of the food, but the authentic, community atmosphere that had become increasingly rare in San Francisco's rapidly gentrifying restaurant scene. More importantly, Victoria's table has become exactly what I had hoped, a place where the spirit of our father's original vision could flourish without the legal constraints and emotional baggage that Caroline's betrayal had attached to Chen's garden. The recipes are the same ones our grandmother taught me, but they've evolved through my own creativity and experience. The service style honors the family-oriented approach our father pioneered, while incorporating improvements I've learned through 20-plus years in the business. The financial success has been gratifying, but the real vindication comes from the relationships we've built. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 80s, still brings flowers from her shop for our dining room tables. The Johnson family has introduced their grown children to Victoria's table, creating a new generation of regular customers. Former Chen's Garden employees who had been fired or driven away by Caroline's management style have found new careers at Victoria's table, bringing with them the institutional knowledge that Caroline had been so eager to discard. 3 years after opening Victoria's table, I received a call that I had been both expecting and dreading. Caroline's real estate practice was struggling, hurt by the reputation damage from the restaurant controversy and her own poor business decisions in an increasingly competitive market. She was facing bankruptcy and had called to ask if I would consider lending her money to save her law practice. The conversation was awkward and painful. Caroline tried to frame her request as a family obligation, suggesting that our father would have wanted us to support each other through difficult times. She spoke about her children's college tuition and her mortgage payments, painting herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. "I know we've had our differences," she said, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard since we were children. "But we're still sisters. We're still family." The irony was overwhelming. Caroline, who had stolen my life's work while our father lay dying, was now asking me to rescue her from the consequences of her own poor judgment. She wanted me to forget her betrayal and extend the same family loyalty that she had so ruthlessly exploited. I listened to her entire pitch without interrupting, letting her make her case in the hope that she might finally acknowledge what she had done to me and to our father's legacy. But even in her desperation, Caroline couldn't bring herself to admit that her actions had been wrong. She spoke about misunderstandings and different approaches to business, but never about betrayal or manipulation or the deliberate destruction of everything our father had built. "I can't help you, Caroline," I said finally. "Not because I don't have the money, but because lending it to you would be enabling behavior that has already caused too much damage." "What's that supposed to mean?" Her vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the angry defensiveness I had come to recognize as her default response to any form of accountability. "It means that you've never acknowledged what you did to me, to Dad's memory, or to the community that supported our family for decades. You've never shown any remorse for the way you manipulated a dying man or destroyed relationships that took generations to build. You're asking for my help, but you've never even apologized for stealing my inheritance." The silence stretched for nearly a minute. When Caroline finally spoke, her voice was cold and controlled. "I didn't steal anything. I made a legitimate business decision that you were too emotional to understand. If you can't see past your resentment to help your own sister, that says more about your character than mine." I hung up the phone without responding. There was nothing left to say. Caroline had been offered one final opportunity to acknowledge her betrayal and perhaps begin the process of healing our relationship, but she had chosen pride and self-justification over honesty and reconciliation. 6 months later, Caroline's law practice folded. She moved to Sacramento to work for a large firm, taking a position that paid less than half what she had been earning as a partner in her own practice. Her reputation in San Francisco's legal community never recovered from the combination of the restaurant scandal and her subsequent business failures. Meanwhile, Victoria's Table continued to thrive. We opened for lunch service, hired additional staff, and began catering private events. I started teaching cooking classes on weekends, sharing the techniques our grandmother had taught me with a new generation of home cooks. The classes always filled up quickly, drawn by people who wanted to learn not just recipes but the philosophy behind the food. The idea that cooking is an act of love and community building. On the 5th anniversary of our father's death, I organized a memorial dinner at Victoria's Table. We served his favorite dishes and invited everyone who had known him, customers from Chen's garden, suppliers who had worked with him, neighborhood friends who had watched him build his American dream one meal at a time. Caroline was not invited, a decision that sparked some family criticism, but felt necessary for my own emotional well-being. During the dinner, Mr. Huang, our former produce supplier, stood up to share a story about our father. "Mr. Chen always paid his bills on time," he said, his heavily accented English still clear and strong despite his advanced age. "But more than that, he treated me with respect. When my wife was in the hospital, he called every day to ask about her condition. When my son graduated from college, he threw a party at the restaurant and wouldn't let me pay for the food. That's the kind of man he was." Similar stories filled the evening, tales of kindness, generosity, and community spirit that painted a picture of our father's true legacy. Not the profit margins and expansion plans that Caroline had focused on, but the human connections that had made Chen's Garden more than just a business. As the evening wound down, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the legal vindication I had once craved, or the financial success that Victoria's Table had achieved, but the preservation and continuation of the values our father had embodied. Caroline might have stolen the restaurant's name and building, but she had never understood what made it valuable. That understanding, and the ability to recreate it in a new form, was something she could never take away from me. Years have passed since Caroline's betrayal first shattered my world, and the sharp edges of anger have dulled into something more manageable. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace with the unchangeable past. I've learned that some relationships cannot be repaired, that some betrayals cut too deep to heal completely. But I've also learned that justice doesn't always come through legal proceedings or public vindication. Sometimes it comes through the simple act of building something better from the wreckage of what was destroyed. Victoria's Table stands as a testament to the power of authenticity over manipulation, community over profit margins, and dedication over entitlement. Every successful dinner service, every satisfied customer, every moment of genuine connection between strangers sharing a meal, these are small victories in the larger battle between Caroline's vision of success and our father's legacy of service. The story of our family's betrayal has become part of the neighborhood's folklore, A cautionary tale about the difference between owning a business and understanding it. New residents learn about it from longtime locals, and the lesson is always the same. Success built on stolen foundations will ultimately crumble, while success earned through honest work and genuine relationships will endure. Caroline and I may never reconcile, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, too destructive to forget. But in the end, her theft taught me something valuable about the nature of true ownership. You can steal someone's property, but you cannot steal their knowledge, their relationships, or their ability to create something new and better. Our father's real legacy lives on, not in the building that bears his restaurant's name, but in the values he taught me, the skills he helped me develop, and the community connections he showed me how to nurture. Caroline may have won the legal battle for Chen's garden, but I won something far more valuable: the knowledge that I could lose everything I thought mattered and still rebuild a life worth living. In the quiet moments after service ends at Victoria's table, when I'm cleaning the kitchen and preparing for the next day, I sometimes think about the path that led me here. The betrayal that felt like the end of my world turned out to be the beginning of something better. Caroline's theft forced me to discover strengths I never knew I had and to create a success that was entirely my own. That may be the most satisfying revenge of all, not the destruction of my betrayer, but the construction of a life so fulfilling that her treachery becomes merely the painful but necessary catalyst for my ultimate triumph. In trying to steal my future, Caroline actually freed me to create a better one. And for that ironic gift, I suppose I should almost be grateful.